Hey guys, here we go. We're going to start talking now in depth about the French Revolution. What I want you to notice as we're going through this, let's compare and contrast with the American Revolution. At the beginning of the American Revolution and at the beginning of the French Revolution, in both cases, we have monarchs. The British have a limitation on their monarchy. It's called a constitutional monarchy. They have parliament there to make laws. That limits the power of the king. Plus, they've got the Ebor. In France, there are no limitations on the power of the king. The king is absolutely in power. They dismissed, we're talking starting in 1789. Well, 175 years before this was the last time that the French legislature met. It's called the Estates General. They had not met for 175 years. They had been dismissed by the king and not called back. You remember Charles I in England. He dismissed Parliament and they weren't recalled for 11 years. And the British thought that was a travesty. They didn't want that to happen again. Well, for 175 years, there's been no legislature meeting in France to limit the power of the king. In fact, Louis the 14th says, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. Okay? He is it. There's nothing else. They believe in the divine right of kings. They believe in absolute authority of kings. The French have been involved in two wars that took them all around the globe. The first was the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War in North America. And they had mounted up a huge, a staggering amount of debt, and they couldn't pay it. And they can't pay that, but what does Louis XVI do? He helps the Americans. Now, we in America are very grateful for that help because without it, we probably don't defeat the British. But the problem is, it bankrupts the French monarchy. They don't have enough money to pay for things. Then, beyond all this spending on foreign policy, they have this bizarre thing going on where the French kings live outside of Paris. They don't live in Paris. They live at a place called Versailles, which is a wonderful, beautiful palace. The king lives there. Not only the king, but hundreds and hundreds of nobles are living there. Now, why are the nobles living there? So the king can keep an eye on them, so they can't revolt. Okay? And they come up with all these bizarre rituals every day that everybody gets involved in to take their minds off the real world. They're living in a fantasy world. So every morning when the king gets up, they have something called the levee, the rising. Oh, I want to help the king get up. And then they have somebody else, oh, I want to be the one to pick out the king's shoes. And then they have somebody else, oh, I want to be the one who helps the king get dressed. And then they even have somebody who gets to empty the chamber pot. What's a chamber pot? In the days before you had indoor plumbing, you just used a pot and you kept it in the room. And somebody would get excited. Some noble would be, oh, I want to be the one to empty the chamber pot. Ooh. And they go on, and it's just crazy. But if you're going to have all this stuff going on, it's going to be very expensive because you got to feed these people, you got to entertain these people. There are constant parties and banquets. This is mounting debts and debts. How are you going to pay for this? Well, they have taxes. Now, remember the last time we talked about French society being divided into three social classes. They're referred to as the three estates. The first estate is the nobles, the second estate is the clergy, and the third estate is made up of everybody else, peasants and merchants and farmers. Now, the merchants and the accountants and the lawyers, they are referred to as the bourgeoisie. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, the first two estates don't pay any taxes. The first two estates make up about 3% of the population, 97% of the people who don't have the money. The first two estates own most of the property and they control most of the wealth in the country. The third estate is made up of peasants. Now, what happens coming along in 1789, in addition to all these problems that they have with their economy already, there's going to be a terrible harvest. And in 1789, that leads to famine. what happens is they have winter comes early in 1788. There's actually snow in August. So, yeah, there were global climate changes even back then. But they can't harvest wheat. With no wheat, there's no bread. And the French people subsist entirely almost on bread. The average French person eats about 2 pounds of bread a day. There begin to be, when you can't get the bread, all of a sudden there's riots, there's social unrest, there are lynchings. And what we are now moving into is something, the first phase of the revolution, that we would call the moderate phase, okay? The moderate phase lasts from about 1789 to 1791. And the dominant people we see here, Jacques Necker and the National Assembly. What happens is Louis the 16th brings in Jacques Necker to be his financial minister. And Jacques Necker says a couple things. Louis, you got to cut back on your spending. You can't keep doing this. And two, you can't keep taxing the people like this. And it is the duty of the French government to make sure that people have stuff to eat. So basically, and he puts this out there in newspapers, okay? He puts this out there in newspapers. And the people love him, okay? And what he does is he convinces Louis to call the Estates General in, okay? And in 1789, they call the Estates General in the spring of 1789. For the first time in 175 years, they are going to meet. Now, the Estates General is divided up, as you would expect, in 3 houses. Each house represents a different estate. The problem is, the first estate and the second estate, the representatives of those 2 estates always vote together. And the result is, there is always a 2/3 to 1/3 majority against the third estate. So the third estate really never gets any say in government. And then what happens when they start verbalizing complaints about this? Louis goes in and he locks out the members of the third estate one day. And what they do, we are now moving into July of 1789. And what they do, the representatives of the third estate leave and they go next door. And they meet in a room. It's like a gym, okay? It's actually a handball court. We refer to it as the tennis court. And they meet there and they start to say, we are the National Assembly and we represent the people. The Estates General is illegitimate. We hold power now. And they take an oath, we are going to continue to meet until we write a new constitution. About this time, there's still all this social unrest going on in Paris itself. Louis calls in about 30,000 troops and they surround Paris. People start to get nervous and mob violence is going to start to take over. This is one of the big differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Now, there was mob violence at the beginning of the American Revolution. We saw some of that, but nothing on a scale that compares with the French Revolution here. So what happens is the mobs rise up and they go to the local armory and they seize weapons there. But there's a problem. This is in the days when they still used flintlock rifles. They need gunpowder. So what do? They know there's a place where there's gunpowder. It's a place called the Bastille, Bastille, okay, or the Bastille sometimes. It's an old fortress. It's guarded by a very small amount of guards, and they are all veterans of wars, and they've been wounded. They're called invalids, okay? So the mob attacks the Bastille. During this, they also hear word that Louis has decided to fire Jacques Necker. So now they don't have any hope of any representation. So they seize the Bastille, they kill the guards, And in what's going to be, they cut off the guards' heads, they put them on a pike, and they march around, and they tear down the Bastille. It was this time of great fear. It's referred to as the Great Fear. They tear down this symbol of oppression, the Bastille, where political prisoners have been taken and tortured. Now, during this time period, we see two different groups of people here rising politically. One, the moderates, and two, the radicals. And in August, the moderates succeed in having published something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And they say everyone has the right to life, liberty, security, and resistance to oppression. So far, so good. We're ending up with a constitutional, and the National Assembly is going to be the governing power. We're going to end up with something that looks a lot like in the United States. But they still continue to have problems with food. On October 5th, 6,000 women from Paris go on a march out to Versailles. And they are led by women who they're fishmongers. They sell fish and they carry big, huge knives. And they're strong, powerful women. And they march all the way out to Versailles. And along the way, they pick up more people. And what happens is, on October 6th, Louis wakes up and there's 20,000 people on his lawn. And they attack that palace. They kill the guards. They do what you always do. They put their heads on pikes. They seize the royal family and they force them to return to Paris so that they will be closer. They can't live in this little fantasy world away from all the problems that everyone else is experiencing. So now the National Assembly is running things. They write a constitution in 1791. Along the way, they also seize church lands and sell them. So this is another thing we're going to start to see here. Big difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. In the American Revolution, we had an emphasis on religious freedom. We're not going to see that. But it's different because we've got the one dominant church, the Roman Catholic Church. So the assembly seizes the church lands and they sell them in an effort to try to pay off their debts. They write a constitution in 1791. The moderates say, okay, we've gotten a semblance of popular sovereignty here. Everything's good. And it looks like things are going to start calming down. But then Louis tries to escape. He's going to go to Austria, where his wife is from. Why is he going to go to Austria? He's going to go to Austria to try and get allies to help him out, to raise an army so he can march back in and try to retake power. They catch him about 6 miles. He almost makes it. They catch him about 6 miles before he gets to Austria. They force him to return to Paris, and this is going to be the beginning of the end for Louis. Okay, and the next thing we're going to see is something called the radical phase. So that's what we'll be talking about next, the radical phase. Okay, right now we've had the moderate phase, and next we're going to go to the radical phase. Okay, talk to you later.